You're watching Live1.tv from New York. The 2024 election for U.S. Senate in New York is right around the corner. Do New Yorkers feel well served by Kristen Gillibrand, Chuck Schumer? DIANE SARE visits our studio to talk about her plans and intentions if she is elected to Senate by the people of New York. Hi, welcome. We are at Live1.tv studio with New York Senate candidate DIANE SARE. Hi, Diane.
Hi.
Thank you so much for coming, Diane, and please tell our listeners who've tuned in about yourself.
Okay, gladly. Well, I am an independent candidate for U.S. Senate in New York. I am a 33-plus year associate of the late Lyndon LaRouche, who probably still is the most controversial American political figure, even with everything they're doing to Donald Trump. And he was the leading economist, I think, ever, really, in terms of physical economy, which is very, very important, especially given the collapse of the United States and the transatlantic world today. So, yes, I am running for U.S. Senate. I actually began my Senate campaign career in 2020 when I declared against Chuck Schumer. And I really wanted to do that because of his threat to Trump on Rachel Maddow. You remember about the auditing of the intelligence agencies, and Schumer said, "That's really stupid. They have 6 ways from Sunday to get back at you," which said to me, that's who Schumer works for. That's what he's beholden to, and that is the big problem, or not but one of the big problems in the nation right now.
Agreed. Live1.tv is impartial, but when you've been around this long, I can say Chuck Schumer is not good for New York. It's a bad trip. And hasn't he been one of the big advocates for taking American taxpayers' money and handing it over for war manufacturing and over in the Ukraine war?
Yes, he's never met a war he doesn't love. Yeah. That's right. He's supported everything, and he's the one ramming through the 60, or trying, hasn't gone through the House yet, the 60 billion more for Ukraine, 17 billion more for Israel. That package really has to be defeated. It'll come up in the House soon.
The funny thing is, did you hear that Chuck Schumer didn't even want an audit performed on the money that they were...
Oh yeah, he shouted down Rand Paul when Rand Paul asked for that, yes.
Right.
And you heard the defense the Pentagon failed their last audit.
Diane, tell us about what it's your plans as a senator, please.
Well, I'll tell you my intention. We'd have to get many more senators like myself elected in order to be able to follow through. But I think first and foremost, we have to take down this financial dictatorship that we're in. And that would require reinstatement of the Glass-Steagall Act of FDR. And the reason why that would be primary is in order to separate banks by function, you have to go through their books. And that means, what are you going to find? Drug money laundering, human trafficking, all kinds of illicit, horrible activity, which they're covering up for. And a lot of this debt, our deficit is $33 trillion, I think. A lot of that is probably illegitimate. But, nobody knows. You don't know what it is. We have so much garbage in our financial system that someone really has to do a kind of reckoning and put the thing through an orderly bankruptcy proceeding. And reinstating Glass-Steagall would be the first step.
Right. Refresh my memory what the Glass-Steagall Act is.
Okay, Steagall. Steagall.
Yeah.
And that was passed actually under Franklin Roosevelt. When he came into office, the first thing he did, virtually starting about 24 hours after he was sworn in, was to declare a bank holiday, because you had all these runs on the banks and people had lost their faith and lost their confidence in the whole system. And during those 4 days, he did what I'm talking about, which is to go through the holdings, and he had local people on the ground, so it was not some big monolith from the federal government overseeing everything, but people in each state were responsible to look at the holdings of the banks, figure out what was legitimate debt, what was illegitimate debt, what you could write off, what had to be restructured. He was on the radio every single day with the American people, telling them what they were doing. And when he reopened the banks, people were lining up to put their money back in. He really restored confidence in the system. So Glass-Steagall came after that because you did not want people's savings accounts to be used as collateral for speculative activity by the banks. So you wanted commercial banking to be strictly commercial banking under one roof, no overlap with investment banking where people were taking a risk. You did not want people using their mortgage or their savings or their retirement. Not now retirements are in speculative activity, but you wanted to protect that so that people would not lose everything. And if people want to gamble, okay, they gamble, they get a higher interest rate if they win. And if they lose, they don't get a bailout. They lose, just like going to Atlantic City or wherever else.
And so what did the act do, and is it still in existence, or was it repealed?
No, it was repealed under Bill Clinton. Robert Rubin actually signed Jeffrey Epstein into the White House no less than 20 times while Bill Clinton was president. And one of the things that I suspect was the point of that was to get Bill Clinton to go along with the repeal of Glass-Steagall.
Wow.
Which turned out to be very lucky for them, because that's how in 2008, when Lehman Brothers and Countrywide and all these things went bankrupt, which should have been allowed to go bankrupt, were bailed out, and they could force banks that were quote unquote solvent to swallow the debt, and then the Federal Reserve could bail them out. So the repeal of Glass-Steagall actually greatly facilitated the taxpayers being on the hook for bailing out the financial crooks who created the mess in the first place. And the situation now is far worse than it was in 2008 because you now have more money because we printed, I don't know, if you add up all of the bailout money, it's in the trillions of dollars. That money is now concentrated in the hands of even fewer people.
Right. Underneath the surface of our bank systems here in New York is thin ice and very unpredictable what could happen. And we have had runs on banks in New York where banks have collapsed and people have been outside. So it's very uncertain. What about the protective measures? I don't know if you're a banking expert, but isn't there something when I go into the bank that says FDIC or something, that there's some kind of mechanism for protecting?
Yes, the Federal Depositors Insurance Corporation. But even in the last round of, what was the name? There was Silverado and the one on the West Coast. And there was one here in New York that went under. And they have peculiar ways to, because some people have more than it's $250,000 and anything above that doesn't get bailed out. Well, that is a problem if your account is a business account and you have people's payroll. It's not just your savings of $250,000, then it means no one gets paid. And when that happened, I know of people who had companies that had nothing to do with the banks in question, but because the way money gets transferred around through cyberspace, it happened to pass through one of those banks, they couldn't issue payroll for several weeks. The money just disappeared into cyberspace. So it's very tenuous. And I think the biggest issue is people have to distinguish between money and physical value. And that was why I stressed LaRouche was a physical economist, not looking at money. Because you have people like Morton Scholes, I think, who won some kind of prize in economics, who it's gaming the system. It's all these various logarithmic functions and you computerize the trading now, so you get computers that make these transactions really quickly and people can get really rich. What does that do for the real economy? Does that fix a road? Does that give someone health care? Does that put food on the table? There's nothing real behind that, but people get very obsessed with it, and it's fictitious. So part of what I'm saying is I would like to take the air out of that bubble, and our government, the Federal Reserve, is unconstitutional. I advocate a national bank, such as what Alexander Hamilton was responsible for, a national bank that can direct credit into things that actually increase the physical productivity of the population, of the workforce. And that's very much the opposite of the kind of mentality that we have today.
Right. So you'd be focusing on providing more fidelity to the banking system right here in New York.
Yes, and nationally. I mean, it's in a way, it's like the elections, right? You want transparency. You want to be able to prove what's there. If you put your money, now you are probably old enough, as am I, to remember when you put your money in a savings account. My first savings account when I was 11 years old, with the $70 that I'd gotten for Christmas, I went to the bank and I got 5% interest.
Wow. Right.
Now, forget it. Now you pay the bank for the privilege of them being able to speculate with your money.
Yeah. Well, that would be great. Okay, so, and what other things would you be focused on as our New York senator, one of our 2 New York senators?
Peace. I would be focused on peace. We are funding war. We are instigating wars. We have genocide going on right now in Gaza. I don't know where this is headed if we don't put a stop to this. I was appalled that the U.S. vetoed a ceasefire yet again. And the idea that somehow a ceasefire means a victory for Hamas is absurd. If the United States was not interested in antagonizing Russia and China, the United States, China, and Russia are powerful enough that our nations could guarantee the security of everyone involved. We could protect people, and we could insist, as we should, on a 2-state solution, going back to the last legally, by international law, recognized agreement, which was UN Resolution 242, 1967 borders. That is the starting point for any agreement.
Did they also give that agreement in '67? Was that the Oslo Accords or something different?
That was later. That was 1993 when Clinton was president, and Bibi Netanyahu, the current prime minister of Israel, instigated the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, the very courageous prime minister who made the agreement with Arafat for those accords. And the tragedy of that was both Rabin and Arafat had the vision that Palestine and Israel, a Palestinian state yet to be determined, which was part of perhaps the problem with that, but that you had to have economic development. And by that, I don't mean real estate. I mean greening the desert, nuclear power for desalinating water, building minimally a highway between the West Bank and Gaza so that a Palestinian state is connected, right? This kind of thing. And Rabin said our region, with Jordan and the other nations, should be a powerhouse for economic development. And Netanyahu incited crowds and said this is anti-Jewish, and Rabin was killed by an Israeli extremist.
Yeah. It is beyond, it's unspeakable what's happening there. So you're very much a peace advocate. What about ideas like bring the troops home? Because we have bases all around the world, and you'd get to vote on that kind of legislation.
Yes, absolutely. And this movement, Defend the Guard, right, that states do not send their National Guard into any foreign activity unless there is an act of war by the Congress, which I think is an excellent initiative.
Tell us about other intentions that you have.
Well, back to my reasoning for running against Schumer, I think we should audit our intelligence agencies.
Right.
I think we should have a clean house cleaning from top to bottom. The idea that Julian Assange could die in prison not because he leaked anything. He was a journalist. He was doing what journalists do. They could jail any reporter from the Washington Post, New York Times, Fox News, or anything, because reporters get information all the time. They're responsible for vetting it and cover it. So he did not commit a crime. Furthermore, under the Espionage Act, how can he be guilty? He's not a U.S. citizen.
Right.
So how can you charge someone who is not a national of the United States of committing treason against the United States? He's an Australian citizen, and the Australian Parliament has voted for him to be pardoned and the charges to be dropped.
It's sadistic. Secretary Bob Gates, Hillary Clinton, it's my feeling. I follow it pretty closely. Before Assange was imprisoned, I enjoyed listening to him. He's a very good communicator, and I found myself interested in things that I normally wouldn't be. And I liked watching and listening to Julian Assange. And I follow that pretty closely, as a matter of fact.
Well, I think they want to make an example of him to terrorize others. And I will tell you, I don't know how familiar you are with the LaRouche case.
I'm not familiar.
But he was causing trouble in two specific ways. One was the 1970s, when he actually put forward not only a peace proposal for the Middle East based on this water development idea, but for an international development bank to destroy the power of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund by getting a block of nations to deploy what he called the debt bomb. And the debt bomb is, if I owe you $50 and I can't pay you, I'm in trouble. But if I and 5,000 other people owe you $50 and we don't pay you, you're in trouble. So the debt bomb was that you organize a block of nations to declare a debt moratorium and break the back of the International Monetary Fund. And LaRouche was meeting with people like Indira Gandhi when she was head of the non-aligned movement before she was Prime Minister of India. She was very good friends with him, and he met with Lopez Portillo, the president of Mexico, in 1982. He was creating this bloc. And Henry Kissinger, in 1982, wrote to the head of the FBI, please do something about the LaRouche people. They're getting obnoxious. We got this through Freedom of Information.
Right.
The other thing LaRouche did was he had a conception of how to end mutual and assured destruction by developing a laser defense against nuclear missiles. And that Ronald Reagan loved the idea. LaRouche happened to meet him at a debate in 1980 in New Hampshire and said, I know you're worried about nuclear war. What if we could make nuclear missiles obsolete through a technological advance? And so when Reagan won, he invited Mr. LaRouche to Washington. And the idea was the US and the Soviet Union jointly develop this. Because if one side had it first, that would tempt someone to nuke the other guy, right? So you had to do it together. And the Soviets ultimately rejected it. But the Bushes, the James Baker IIIs, the British in a big way, really objected to this because their game is divide and rule. keep us on tenterhooks, keep us on the brink of nuclear war all the time. You don't want to make nuclear missiles obsolete. So the Soviets rejected it, and LaRouche told them, if you try and go off on your own, because I know you're going to do that, you're going to cannibalize your economy and you're going to go bankrupt and disintegrate within 5 years. They did. He was 100% right. Reagan stuck to it. And this really did lead to the Berlin Wall coming down, this policy of LaRouche, which he also called for in 1986, in the middle of this arc. So Reagan's announcement of the SDI was 1983. 1986, LaRouche candidates begin winning elections all over the country. So October 6, 1986, 400 FBI agents, U.S. Marshals, armored vehicle carriers, helicopters descend on LaRouche's home in Virginia with the intent to assassinate him. And by the way, one of the key people involved, there were many agencies involved in this attempt, was, his last name is Koch, I think, but it's Jen Easterly's father, Jen Easterly of the cyber security blah, 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 where they're trying to control the elections now. So LaRouche at that time sent a telegram to Reagan and said, if they storm my house, I'll defend myself. Any bloodshed will be on your hands. Reagan called it off, called off the raid. But it would have been a Waco type incident, which was averted.
400 agents to send. So
400.
I have to learn about this. I'm interested in hearing about that.
Yeah. And then they went from his home to the office, which was in Leesburg, Virginia, and seized boxes and boxes and boxes of files and personal documents. And this was later used to shut down all of LaRouche's publications. Because after they seized all this material, and it might not have been that time, but another time, at any rate, it got to the point where the government was demanding that organizers turn over their personal notebooks, which people refused to do. So the government then levied fines of something like $1 million per day. And they knew that LaRouche-associated companies did not have $50 million or however much it added up to. So one fine day, they came and actually shut down all of our offices, seized everything, seized the bank accounts, and made it illegal because the government now had seized all these accounts, saying that LaRouche owed them this money, LaRouche Publications owed them the money. They said, you are hereby involuntarily bankrupt, making it illegal to repay lenders.
Wow.
And then the FBI, having gotten all of our lists, called up all the lenders and said, did you know the LaRouche people were stealing your money? They never intended to repay you. And they would get people who were scared to testify that LaRouche fundraisers had willingly stolen their money with no intent to repay it. And it's the credit of our organizing. They got very, very few people to turn. My late mother-in-law was one such person, and she told me she got called by the FBI nonstop to try and get her to testify against LaRouche, which she refused. She told them to get lost. I'm not having any part of this. And I think a lot of people did. But that's so they charged LaRouche with conspiracy to confuse the Internal Revenue Service. They charged about a dozen of his associates with conspiracy to not repay loans and securities fraud, where they made up a new law that if you take a political loan and you don't have a stockbroker's license, you are guilty of securities fraud. So LaRouche was given a 15-year jail sentence at the age of 67. He served 5 years in federal prison. One of my associates, Mike Billington, was given a 77-year jail sentence. He served 11 years in prison. A wonderful couple, Paul and Anita Gallagher, married couple, they were given, I forget, 6 or however many years in 2 separate prisons. They couldn't even communicate with each other. I mean, it was very, very brutal. It was very heavy-handed. And on the appeal former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark took the case. He came to us. He said,
Right.
this is so egregious. You have a guy who's running for president, who's got 250,000 subscribers. And Clark said, never in my career have I seen a broader range of coordinated government, intelligence agency, law enforcement, media collaboration than in the LaRouche case. So Ramsey Clark believed that the LaRouche case was a precedent-setting case to target political leaders.
Thank you, Diane, for sharing this. I am now going to do some homework. Have you had a chance to see about the Wikipedia? Is that a fair kind of cheater's notes to kind of get up to speed, or do they smear him in that Wikipedia?
No, absolutely not. I mean, and in fact, I met a fellow on the street. We're on the street organizing all the time. That was one of the best things LaRouche did, was to create this Socratic dialogue on the sidewalk with the literature table. So a couple years ago, I signed up a professor or somebody out near Columbia University. I called him back, and he said, LaRouche is the first person that I ever saw called a Nazi and a communist in the same paragraph. And he said, that's amazing. What did he do that got them to be so angry at him?
Yeah. And what did he do that got them to be so angry, Diane?
He threatened to bring down the system because that debt bomb,
yeah,
that would have obliterated the power of the Anglo-Dutch financial oligarchy. Mm-hmm. And in fact, this is the really wonderful thing. What you see happening now with the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, their talk of a new currency, they have their own development bank. They are in effect doing exactly what LaRouche was proposing in 1975. And it's not a coincidence, because you look at who are the big players. Russia. LaRouche warned Russia. And when he went to jail, he was made an honorary member of the Academy of Sciences of Russia, because they were so blown away at how he could know they were going to disintegrate when they didn't. So they didn't like him. They didn't appreciate it, but they also were somewhat, this is a serious guy. China, LaRouche's wife was in China in 1996, telling them they should revive the Silk Road. Look what they're doing now. And then India, I already told you of their friendship with Indira Gandhi. So the leading Russian economist today, Sergei Glaziev, made a very nice video on the 100th anniversary of LaRouche's birth, where he says explicitly that the nations that are prospering now, you can see the legacy of LaRouche's life's work. And I would say that is the American system of political economy. That is, what did John Quincy Adams say? He said the Declaration of Independence is universal. The point of our republic is, and Kennedy said this later, and it's scriptural, a beacon on a hill. For what? Not to run around bludgeoning everyone else, but that we set an example for actual political freedom, which means a decent standard of living, right? It means you're not scratching in the dirt, and that other nations could emulate this. So that for us, it should be a source of delight that China just lifted 700 million people out of poverty. But instead, we say, this is a threat, we must crush them, right? So somehow we're threatened because we abandoned our own principles. We abandoned everything that we stood for, and now we're going to run around bludgeoning anyone else who even has an echo. It's like through a distant mirror, through a glass darkly, right? There's echoes of the American Revolution all over the world, people throwing off the colonial masters. And instead of us delighting in it, we're trying to crush them.
Right. Yeah, and one of the things I think is so sad, my dad was an anthropologist and went to the North Pole 19 times and wrote books on Eskimos and traveled to many countries in the world And so I had an interest in traveling, and it won't happen. I'm not going to be able to go to Iraq and see the former Babylon or the artifacts there. I'm even worried if I go to Egypt, I'll be getting a falafel and somebody will come up on a moped and kill me with a pistol. The antagonism of this foreign policy is created against Americans. And for someone who likes travel and learning new things, you have lost things, America, we have lost things that people haven't even begun to tabulate, being able to visit these countries and whatnot. And I think it's so unnecessary that we do have great things to offer the countries, other countries, not just death robots and drone killing machines.
Right.
And also one last thing, this whole American policy is only helping the largest American companies, and sometimes they have to have armed convoys to get their goods in, and small businesses don't have a chance. And a small business could be a business that only makes $10,000 a year, but a small business is also a $5-10 million business. And these businesses don't have the chance or the opportunity to go to other parts in the world. It could be any type of business. So it's a really aggressive, and the blowback where we're now being, we're going to be at the mercy of other countries in the world if we keep this up.
Well, except they don't really bear us ill will. And also most countries actually really believe there's a great distinction between the American people and our government. So
Right.
Speaking of Egypt, I have a friend who just married someone in Egypt and went to visit him.
Mm-hmm.
And she had no problem. There was no ill will. People really say, we know your government doesn't reflect you.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, we've talked a lot about international affairs, which is really important because now it really is the global village, like Marshall McLuhan, I think, said, a global village. But tell me more about things for the people in New York and why they should go to the trouble of going to the precinct and casting their vote for DIANE SARE versus the other candidate, Christian Gillibrand.
Well, oh my goodness.
Count the
Where do I
ways?
start? Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, really. Well, let me put it this way, which people may find a little jarring, but I'd ask them to think through. I'm an avid supporter of the space program. Now, when we went to the moon, NASA employed 40,000 people. The companies feeding into NASA employed 400,000 people. So the money was spent not on the moon, the money was spent here in the United States. What many New Yorkers may not know is that there are 157 New York companies involved in the next moon landing.
Wow.
Now imagine if we funded that.
Mm-hmm.
How many people in New York could they employ? And what kind of infrastructure would we need in the state to support these industries? Would it not be prudent to have a high-speed rail corridor from the high-tech sector in Long Island through New York City, out one way out to Pennsylvania and that industrial belt, but also up to Albany, Syracuse, Rochester, Buffalo, that whole industrial corridor? What would it mean to have modern high-speed transportation? Now, of course, in order to have that, it's another thing we need, electricity. We're going to have blackouts because of the, in my opinion, idiotic shutdown of Indian Point nuclear plant, the idiotic shutdown of Shoreham, which is a perfectly functional plant, and they not only shut it down, they drilled a hole in the containment vessel so it could never be reopened. If you want to use solar panels and windmills, you can cover the entirety of Long Island with these things, which are very vulnerable to weather and very unreliable, and you would not really get enough energy to power maybe a few skyscrapers in Manhattan. I mean, it's really natural gas, oil, coal, clean coal. It's been cleaned up. About 99% of the toxins have been, it's been very cleaned up. We need energy. I think nuclear fission is the way to go. Fusion we have to develop. So these things also would become important for New York. And if you had a crash program, say, to not only get back to the moon, but to establish a manned colony on Mars, all of the spin-offs, when we went to the moon, people know Teflon, Velcro, milk purification, microwave ovens, laptop computers, cell phones, all of these came out of that initiative.
Right.
So that would mean a huge difference for New York. And in fact, my younger colleague, Jose Vega from the Bronx, who's challenging Richie Torres.
Yeah, and I certainly hope he wins. Jose Vega is challenging Richie Torres in the Bronx.
And he is calling for a space CCC.
Okay.
He said we should take these young people from the Bronx and get them in the space program. They should become engineers and scientists and physicists and mathematicians and biologists and make the Bronx a hub for the educational preparatory work to create a new generation of scientists.
Right. Diane, I learned a few months ago that the lunar module had some of its components built right on Long Island. The lunar module was the landing vehicle that went on the moon, and Long Island, New York had a big part in that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I have a very dear friend who worked on that, and now he's in real estate because we shut it down.
Right.
The magnetically levitated rail, that came from Brookhaven
Okay.
Labs, the guys who came up with that, where you're floating on a magnetic field.
Right.
And I just heard China is now, we sold the patent to Japan. The Japanese came and said, well, we can see you're never going to build it. We wish you would build it, but since you're not, can we buy it? So the Japanese bought the patent from us to build maglev. They're using it like crazy. Spain has a huge amount of maglev rail. China has some. China's now experimenting with maglev in a vacuum tunnel, and they just achieved a breakthrough in speeds. They're going for 2,000 kilometers an hour, which is about 1,300 miles an hour. That's like 3 times as fast as an airplane.
Wow.
Anyway, whatever they did, they just got speed so high it's classified. They won't tell us.
Hypersonic maglev
Isn't
travel.
that?
It is impressive.
And here on Long Island, and I have a friend, and actually, hopefully we're going to have a meeting somewhere near you in the near future with an engineer who lives on Long Island who's involved in maglev. And he says that he would work with me to devise a program for New York where we reopen the Grumman. They have some kind of gigantic testing space. And maglev, the one drawback of it is that right now it really only works on you have to have straight corridors. So if you need to turn corners, it's not so good. He said the new breakthrough that the US could make is to develop a slow maglev that can do corners. Maybe we'd replace the New York subway with this, but you would test it in Grumman. He said if you did that, you'd employ 30,000 people there. Think of the real estate market. Think of, why not? I think it's a beautiful plan. Maybe a bunch of our Bronx CCC science guys would end up over at Grumman on Long Island working on this.
Hopefully they will.
Yeah.
Diane, we have a couple more minutes here, and I hope you'll come back often. Please tell us some more things, and then we'll wrap up our interview, and hopefully you'll come back again soon.
Well, I will say I think we are in a revolutionary moment. Not covered much in the United States is that there are tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of farmers in the streets all over Europe because they can't afford the price of fuel, because the so-called green regulations are shutting down our food supply. They're being asked to do crazy things like measure the levels of nitrate in their cow manure and shut down production. That's very big. What we see in the streets of the U.S., the young people who are anguished over the genocide in Gaza, it's the first time I've seen people so emotionally connected to the fate of other human beings. And I think this is very ripe, but it needs a direction. We need to have a vision for the future, for what peace looks like. It can't just be anti-war. It has to be pro-development. And that's why I love working on the question of why the United States actually was founded, which was we were supposed to be a bulwark against colonialism. We defeated the British Empire. And people should take a minute and reread the Declaration of Independence and look at all of our grievances, which are exactly what we are now doing. We have become that which we liberated ourselves from. And I think this is the moment that we can reverse it. And my concern, and the reason really why I'm stepping forward, is that I hope I can provide some leadership to give direction for this process, this new movement, the new future that I think is before us.
Anything else? It's been great talking with you, and obviously there's more to talk about. Should we end it there and have you come back soon, or is there?
Sure. No, there's nothing else excepting I'd like to tell people how to find me. Can I do that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So my website is sareforsenate.com, and it's all the words spelled out, SAREFOR, Senate.com. I am on Facebook, X, Telegram, sort of, TikTok, Instagram.
Right. There's so many.
There are so many, and I really don't like them. They're all kind of, you know, but we have to resort to that, especially given that you've got CIA and FBI agents now, or the anchorman at MSNBC and all the mainstream press. So that's where we go.
Too true. Thank you, Diane. I appreciate you coming to LiveOne.tv. It's been great having you. Come back again soon. And don't forget to visit Diane's website and vote in 2024.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.